The dining hall of the Whitman estate gleamed like a temple to old money and cold ambition. A chandelier the size of a small car dripped with crystal, casting fractured light across the polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch for miles. Silverware lay perfectly aligned, wine glasses filled but untouched. No one was eating, no one was speaking. At the head of the table, I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my posture flawless. Across from me sat Margaret Whitman, the matriarch of this dynasty, a woman who once held everyone in this room in the palm of her hand. But not tonight. Tonight, Margaret's carefully painted face was pale, her lips pressed tight as she stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and rage. Around us, members of the Whitman family shifted uncomfortably in their seats, darting glances between us, as if waiting for someone to break the silence. No one dared. The power in this room had shifted, and they all felt it. My gaze never wavered from Margaret's. My voice, when it came, was calm and deliberate, like the steady tick of a clock. "The night Margaret Whitman cast me out of this house," I began, my words slicing through the silence, "she told me I'd never belong." Margaret's fingers tightened around her wineglass. A single drop of red slid down the stem like blood. "She thought she'd won," I continued. "But as I sit here now, at the very head of her table, watching her realize who truly holds the power, I let the moment stretch, savoring it, the culmination of years of patience, of silent moves made in the shadows while Margaret believed me gone and forgotten. Finally, I leaned forward slightly, delivering the line I'd waited a decade to speak. "I can finally say she was right about one thing." A hush fell deeper over the room. Margaret's breath caught. "I don't belong here," I said softly, with a smile that was anything but kind. "I own it." The words hung in the air like the toll of a bell, sealing her fate. And with that, we fall back in time, to the night it all began. The night I was cast out, humiliated, and underestimated. The night Margaret Whitman unknowingly forged her own downfall. When I first met Daniel Whitman, I didn't see the empire behind his last name. I saw the man, the way his laugh filled a room, how he listened when I spoke, how he made me feel like I wasn't invisible in a world that often rushed people like me. I was 31, fresh out of graduate school, and working as a project coordinator at a local nonprofit in Boston. My life was ordinary but full of hope. A small apartment, a tight circle of friends, and a dream that love and hard work could build something lasting. Daniel seemed to fit perfectly into that dream. He was charming, attentive, and endlessly patient, or so I thought. When he spoke about his family, it was with a mix of pride and distance, as though the Whitman name carried a weight he wasn't sure he wanted me to feel just yet. It wasn't until our engagement dinner that I fully understood. The Whitman estate, tucked away in the elite suburb of Brookline, just outside Boston, wasn't a house. It was a kingdom. The driveway stretched longer than the block I'd grown up on. The cold marble floors gleamed like mirrors, and staff moved with choreographed precision, their eyes always lowered. Even the walls seemed to hum with old money and silent judgment. That night, standing in their grand dining room beneath a chandelier worth more than my entire apartment building, I realized I wasn't just marrying Daniel. I was marrying into power. At the head of the table sat Margaret Whitman, Daniel's mother. Margaret was a study in control. Her posture was perfect, her pearls gleaming, her smile precise and deliberate. She rose to greet me with a kiss on the cheek that was warm on the surface but cool just beneath. "Welcome to the family, Sophie," she said smoothly. "You'll find we take care of our own here." The words thrilled me at first. Family, that's what I'd always wanted, a sense of belonging, of roots deeper than my own modest upbringing. But over the course of the evening, I began to sense the undercurrents. Conversations were laced with subtle jabs, comments about my middle-class parents and their quaint professions, backhanded compliments about my education, as though my degrees were charming little trinkets, nothing more. Questions about when Daniel and I would step up and carry on the Whitman legacy. Through it all, Margaret smiled at me like a benevolent queen bestowing her favor on a humble subject. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, whispering, "Don't mind her, that's just how she is." I smiled back, determined not to let the coldness of the room seep into me. This was my chance to prove myself, to show Margaret and everyone else that I wasn't just the girl who grew up on a quiet street with parents who worked 9-to-5 jobs. I was Daniel's wife. I was part of this family. For a time, I let myself believe that love would bridge the gap between my world and theirs. I pictured holidays filled with laughter, children running through the estate's manicured gardens, Margaret embracing me like the daughter she never had. But Margaret Whitman had other plans. Late at night, I'd hear her voice drifting down the hall, low and sharp, as she spoke to Daniel behind closed doors. "She's sweet, Daniel," Margaret would say, with the kind of sweetness that carried venom beneath it. "But she doesn't understand our world. You need someone who strengthens the family name, not someone who clings to it." At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. Daniel loved me. He'd chosen me. Still, sometimes, when he looked at me, I caught a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a shadow Margaret had planted there, slowly taking root. I didn't know it then, but those whispers were the beginning of the war I was about to fight, a war I didn't yet realize I was already losing. At first, the changes were so small I almost missed them. A subtle shift in Daniel's tone, a hesitation before he answered me, a hint of doubt in his eyes where there used to be certainty. It was as if an invisible hand had begun turning the screws on our marriage, one imperceptible twist at a time. And that hand belonged to Margaret Whitman. Daniel had always been confident in my ideas. When we first married, he'd come to me with business dilemmas, philanthropic initiatives, even family disputes, eager to hear my perspective. But slowly, his words began to sound rehearsed, polished, not his own. One evening, we were discussing a proposal for a new community outreach program. Daniel frowned at my suggestion and said, almost mechanically, "That's quaint, Sophie, but it's not really aligned with the Whitman brand." It wasn't just the word. It was exactly the same phrasing Margaret had used earlier that week at dinner. The first time I noticed, I let it slide. The second time, my stomach tightened. By the third, I realized he wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. Margaret's voice was coming through his lips. Family dinners, once merely awkward, became battlegrounds. Margaret would fix her sharp, appraising gaze on me across the long dining table and ask questions that seemed harmless at first until I heard the barbs beneath them. "So, Sophie," she'd begin, sipping her wine with deliberate grace, "how are you adjusting to the demands of our lifestyle? It must be quite a leap from, what was it your parents did again? Teaching and accounting, wasn't it?" The table would chuckle politely while my cheeks burned. Or, "Do you ever worry, dear, about keeping up with Daniel's pace? It takes a certain stamina to be the wife of a Whitman." Each question was a dagger wrapped in silk, designed to leave me bleeding without anyone seeing the wound. Daniel never defended me. Sometimes he even laughed along, as if to prove he wasn't weak or blinded by love. Behind closed doors, I'd confront him. "She's undermining me, Daniel. Can't you see it?" He'd sigh, weary and exasperated. "Sophie, you're overreacting. My mother just wants what's best for us, for me. You're taking it too personally." And just like that, our fights began. Margaret never raised her voice at me directly. She didn't need to. She framed herself as the benevolent guide, the one trying to save Daniel from my supposed inadequacies. I overheard her once through the crack of Daniel's office door. "Daniel, you deserve a wife who understands our world, our legacy. It's not her fault she doesn't, but this family can't afford weakness." That night, Daniel was distant, cold. When he kissed me goodnight, it felt like a formality rather than love. I tried everything to prove her wrong. I volunteered at the Whitman Foundation, spending hours organizing fundraisers and charity galas. I learned the unspoken rules of the elite social circles, smiled through backhanded compliments, and perfected the mask of effortless grace. At public events, Margaret praised me to the guests, calling me a vital part of the family. But when we were alone, her warmth vanished. One evening, after a charity auction, she invited me to the estate's private wine cellar. The room was quiet, intimate, lined with bottles older than I was. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, she was going to finally accept me. Margaret poured 2 glasses of deep red wine, handing one to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've been trying very hard, Sophie," she said softly. "I see that, and I admire." My chest lifted with hope, only to have it dashed by her next words. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper sharp enough to cut glass. "But some women are born Whitmans." She let the words linger, her gaze cold and unwavering. "Others," she added, leaning in so close I could smell the wine on her breath, "merely marry into it." And with that, she turned, leaving me alone in the dim cellar with the taste of humiliation burning on my tongue. It was the moment I finally understood. I wasn't just unwanted here, I was being systematically erased. Margaret didn't strike all at once. She was far too clever for that. Her war against me was waged in whispers, delivered behind closed doors and over polished dinner tables with crystal glasses gleaming between us. It began subtly, little rumors that seemed almost harmless at first, like a drop of ink in clear water. At luncheons with the Whitman wives, I began to notice conversations stopping when I entered. Polite smiles, followed by sidelong glances. Laughter that felt too sharp, too knowing. "She's overwhelmed," someone would say softly, just within earshot. "She doesn't really understand how this family operates." Or, my personal favorite, "Poor Sophie, she's trying, but..." The unspoken ending hung heavy in the air. "She'll never be enough." It wasn't just social. Margaret knew exactly where to strike next. Household staff began mentioning small concerns to Daniel, about my supposed spending habits, about mistakes I'd supposedly made with charity accounts I managed. Of course, none of it was true, but Margaret's brilliance was that she never accused me outright. She simply created an atmosphere where Daniel began to wonder. And when doubt takes root in a marriage, it grows like a weed. I'd catch Daniel watching me, his brow furrowed as if trying to solve a puzzle he didn't quite trust himself to piece together. Conversations grew tense. His questions, once loving, now felt like interrogations. "Did you really authorize that donation? Why are the books showing a discrepancy?" Every word, every look between us was a seed Margaret had planted. The final blow came at the Whitman Winter Gala, a glittering affair at the Grand Boston Hotel the family owned. The ballroom was awash with gold light and power brokers in tailored suits. Margaret floated through the crowd like a queen holding court, her hand brushing shoulders, her lips curving into that perfect, gracious smile. And everywhere she went, she left destruction behind. I saw her lean close to one board member, whisper something that made him glance at me with thinly veiled disdain. She clasped another woman's hand and murmured sympathetically, as though consoling her over some great tragedy. Me. By the time dinner was served, I knew. The room was no longer neutral ground. It was a battlefield I'd already lost. 2 nights later, Daniel asked me to meet him in Margaret's private study. The room was immaculate, filled with dark wood and shelves of leather-bound ledgers. Margaret sat in a high-backed chair near the window, a glass of wine in her hand, as silent and still as a queen observing a royal proceeding. Daniel didn't look at me at first. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a stack of papers. "This isn't working, Sophie," he said finally, his voice hollow. "The family needs stability. It needs strength." I stared at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Daniel, we are the family. We are supposed to..." He cut me off, his gaze flicking toward Margaret like a frightened child seeking approval. "You don't belong here, Sophie." The words hit harder than any scream could have. They weren't his, they were hers. Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smile as she added softly, almost tenderly, "Some women thrive in the spotlight, my dear. Others fade. Daniel slid the divorce papers across the desk, his hand pulling back quickly like he couldn't bear to touch me anymore. Before I could speak, the staff entered, 2 men I'd known for years, now avoiding my eyes as they escorted me out like I was a trespasser instead of the woman who had lived here, loved here. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I walked out with my head held high, clutching nothing but my dignity. Behind me, the heavy doors closed with a final, echoing thud. Margaret stood victorious, certain she had erased me completely. But as I crossed the frozen drive that night, one truth settled deep into my bones. Margaret had ended my marriage. She hadn't ended me. The Whitman estate had always felt cold, but the silence of my tiny one-bedroom apartment was worse. The first night I slept there, surrounded by unpacked boxes and peeling paint, the quiet pressed against me like a weight. Gone were the polished marble floors, the endless hallways echoing with footsteps of staff, the smell of roses arranged fresh every morning by someone I never had to ask. Now there was just me and the hum of an old radiator that clicked and groaned like it resented my presence. I'd left the Whitman house with nothing but a suitcase and a few photographs I'd managed to grab before the staff ushered me out. Daniel hadn't fought for me. Margaret hadn't even watched me leave. The world I had built my life around had vanished overnight, and I was left trying to breathe in a space that felt too small for my grief. A week later, an envelope arrived. The handwriting on the front was perfect, elegant, sharp, unmistakable. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a check, neatly folded and clipped to a note written in that same flawless script. "For your expenses, Margaret Whitman." I stared at it for a long time. The number on the check wasn't insignificant, but it was nothing compared to what I had lost. It wasn't help, it was an insult, a reminder that she believed she controlled even the scraps of my survival. For a moment, I wanted to tear it in half, to scream and throw it across the room, but I didn't. I folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it away in a drawer I never opened again. Margaret wanted me angry. She wanted me broken and reckless so she could point and say, "See, I was right." Instead, I gave her silence. Still, the days blurred together, grief, anger, and loneliness weaving into something heavy and relentless. I had no plan, no future, and no idea how to fight someone like Margaret Whitman. Then, one rainy evening, as I unpacked a box of documents I'd taken by mistake from Daniel's old home office, I found something strange. It was a stack of papers bound with a faded ribbon. Contracts, ownership records, the kind of legal documents Daniel never personally handled. He always left those details to Margaret and the company lawyers. As I skimmed through them, my heart began to pound. Buried in those pages was a transfer of shares. Small, almost laughably so, just a sliver of Whitman Holdings. But the signature at the bottom stopped me cold. Daniel's late grandfather, Harold Whitman. He had left those shares to me, quietly, without Margaret's knowledge. The document was old but valid, stamped and notarized. And somehow, in Margaret's scramble to erase me, she had overlooked it completely. The next morning, I met with Mr. Carter, the family's longtime accountant. He was one of the few people I trusted, a man who had known me since the day Daniel first brought me home. He adjusted his glasses, studying the papers with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "It's not much," he said finally, his voice measured. "But Sophie, if you play this right, it could grow. It could matter." I stared at him, hardly breathing. "And Margaret doesn't know?" He shook his head. "She's too certain of her own control. She assumes you have nothing." Margaret's arrogance, her fatal flaw. For the first time since I'd been cast out, a slow, steady spark lit inside me. Not hope, not yet, something sharper. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "Then we don't tell her," I said softly. "We let her believe I'm gone, invisible." Mr. Carter gave a small, knowing smile. Invisible can be powerful. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment and stared out at the city skyline through rain-streaked windows. Margaret had cast me out, certain she'd ended me, but she had missed something, a single, overlooked detail that could become her undoing. I whispered into the dark, my voice steady, certain. She thought she'd written my ending. She only gave me my beginning. The first thing I had to do was admit the truth. I didn't know enough. Margaret Whitman had spent her entire life learning how to wield power. She'd been born into it, raised on its rules and weapons. I was an outsider, middle class at heart, a woman who had once believed that love and kindness could be enough to win a place at the table. I had been wrong. If I wanted to fight Margaret, I needed to become fluent in her language, the language of control, leverage, and strategy. So I began with books. Night after night, in my cramped apartment, I sat at a rickety desk lit by a single lamp and devoured everything I could find. Finance, corporate law, mergers, stock acquisition. During the day, I worked temp jobs to keep myself afloat. At night, I studied until my eyes ached and my mind burned. Eventually, books weren't enough. I enrolled in night classes at a local university, sitting in lecture halls beside ambitious 20-somethings with bright futures. I was the quiet woman in the back, older, invisible, and determined. While Margaret Whitman was hosting charity galas under crystal chandeliers, I was hunched over textbooks, learning how to dismantle her empire piece by piece. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Knowledge was my first weapon. Once I understood the game, I began to play it. Using the small stake Harold Whitman had left me, I opened anonymous accounts and shell companies, each one carefully hidden behind layers of legal protection. Through these faceless entities, I began to buy Whitman Holdings stock. At first, it was barely noticeable, tiny percentages here and there, swallowed up in the churn of the market. But I was patient. Every time Margaret mismanaged something, every time an executive grumbled about her decisions, I was there, quietly scooping up another sliver of influence. I never moved too quickly, never enough to draw attention. To the world, Sophie Whitman had disappeared. To Margaret, I was a ghost, a non-factor, exactly what I wanted her to think. Networking came next. I began attending industry events, not as myself, but under different names. A simple dress, a sleek hairstyle, a forged business card with a made-up title. People underestimate women who appear to be assistants or consultants. They talk freely around you, thinking you have no power. I listened. I learned who resented Margaret, who wanted more than she'd given them, who might be persuaded to vote against her when the time came. I didn't need them to love me. I only needed them to see Margaret as a liability. One by one, I built quiet alliances, not promises of revenge, not grand declarations, just subtle agreements and mutual interests. Meanwhile, Margaret was thriving in her own illusion. I'd see her face on the society pages, glittering parties at the Whitman estate, interviews about legacy and vision. She was so certain I'd vanished that she never bothered to look over her shoulder. Her arrogance was my camouflage. Years passed. My life became a rhythm of quiet planning, late nights studying spreadsheets while sipping cheap coffee, closed-door meetings with lawyers and accountants in dimly lit rooms, a constant stream of signed papers, transferred shares, and silent handshakes. It was exhausting, lonely work. But every time doubt crept in, I pictured Margaret's smile the day she'd cast me out. That memory hardened me. The moment finally came quietly, almost anticlimactically. I sat alone at my desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, when my lawyer slid a final document across the table. "Congratulations," he said simply. "Through your proxies and shell companies, you now control the majority stake in Whitman Holdings." For a moment, I just stared at it, numb. Years of secrecy, strategy, and sacrifice condensed into a single piece of paper. Margaret still believed she ruled the kingdom. She had no idea that her throne now rested on foundations I owned. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I didn't need to storm the gates," I whispered. "I simply bought them." The Whitman estate gleamed like a palace that night, every chandelier blazing, every marble surface polished to a perfect sheen. Outside, a fleet of black town cars lined the driveway, each one delivering another guest to Margaret's grand celebration. Inside the dining hall, the long mahogany table was dressed like a coronation. Crystal glasses, gold-rimmed china, and flower arrangements so extravagant they seemed almost obscene. It was the kind of display Margaret Whitman lived for, a statement of dominance as much as elegance. Tonight was her victory lap. The Whitman family company had just closed a massive international deal, one that Margaret claimed would secure the family legacy for generations. The press had been raving about it for weeks, and Margaret was basking in the glow of it all. She stood at the head of the table, draped in a deep emerald gown, her diamond necklace glittering under the chandelier's light. "This," she declared to her gathered relatives and top executives, "is the culmination of decades of leadership, my leadership. While others have faltered or left this family behind, I've stood firm. I've protected what was ours." Polite applause rippled through the room. Some clapped enthusiastically, others with the forced politeness of people who didn't dare do otherwise. Margaret basked in it, mistaking fear for respect. As the noise died down, she raised her glass for a toast. "Tonight, we celebrate strength, survival. The Whitman name will endure because I have ensured it." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices blending into a soft, obedient hum. And then, as the room settled, the doors at the far end opened. A hush fell over the table. I stepped through, every eye turning toward me. It had been more than a decade since I'd last walked these halls. Once, I had been escorted out like a criminal, humiliated and stripped of everything. But tonight, I returned on my own terms. I wore a sleek black gown, understated but commanding, with a single string of pearls at my throat. My hair was pulled back neatly, my expression calm, unreadable. I didn't rush. Each step across the marble floor was measured, deliberate, echoing faintly in the stunned silence. Whispers rippled through the guests. A few gasps escaped. Margaret's lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. She didn't look surprised, only amused. "Well," she said, her tone cutting through the silence, "look who decided to crawl back." I met her gaze evenly. "Good evening, Margaret." The room held its breath. Margaret's smugness only deepened. She turned back to the guests, lifting her glass again. "Family," she said smoothly, "you'll have to forgive Sophie's interruption. I suppose it's difficult for some people to stay away from greatness, even after they've been shown the door." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter followed. Margaret raised her glass higher, her voice sharp as a blade. "To those who couldn't survive in this family," she said, eyes locked on mine, "may they find peace, far, far away from our table." The room erupted in polite applause again, but beneath the tablecloth, my hand curled into a fist. Margaret had no idea how close she was to losing everything, no idea that this was my table now. She just hadn't realized it yet. For a moment after Margaret's toast, there was only the clinking of crystal glasses and the polite murmur of conversation. She stood at the head of the table, soaking in the admiration like a queen certain of her crown. And then, slowly, I rose to my feet. The movement was calm, deliberate. My chair slid back with a quiet scrape that seemed to echo louder than the applause. Conversations stilled. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, confusion rippling across the long, glittering table. Margaret's gaze snapped to mine, sharp and commanding. "This is hardly the time for personal grievances, Sophie," she said, her tone dismissive, cutting through the air like a whip. "Sit down." But I didn't sit. Instead, I let the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer before speaking, my voice steady and clear. "Thank you," I said, looking first at the guests, then the family members seated around the table. "Thank you all for being here tonight, and for supporting the Whitman legacy." My words were polite, but the undercurrent was unmistakable, controlled, confident, unyielding. Margaret's smirk returned, brittle but still intact. She gestured vaguely with her glass. Yes, we're all quite proud." Now, I raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Tonight," I continued smoothly, "I'd like to take a moment to share something important, something overdue." Margaret's eyes narrowed. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension beneath my calm exterior. I drew a breath and began. For more than a decade, this company has been led by a single vision, Margaret's vision, and for that, we've all given our applause, our loyalty, and our faith. I paused, letting my gaze sweep the room. But visions can cloud judgment, and loyalty, I said softly, can be redirected. From beneath the table, I pulled out a neatly folded stack of documents and set them down beside my untouched glass. These, I said, my tone like a scalpel, precise and cutting, are the records of every share acquired over the past 12 years, quietly, methodically, through channels no one thought to question. A ripple of murmurs swept through the guests. Heads turned, eyes widening. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp, almost panicked. I didn't answer her immediately. I turned instead toward the far end of the table, where two board members sat rigidly, their faces pale but resolute. "These men," I said, "and several others who couldn't be here tonight, have pledged their full backing to me." Gasps, whispers. The air seemed to thin, every breath tight and shallow. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down her wineglass. "This is absurd," she spat. "You're nothing, a cast-off, a mistake." Finally, I looked directly at her, my voice low and even. "Am I? Because as of this evening, I hold 53% of the voting stock." The room erupted into shocked exclamations. Someone dropped a fork. A journalist seated near the back audibly gasped. Margaret's face drained of color. You're lying." I slid the final document toward her across the polished mahogany, its surface reflecting her stunned expression. "Court certified," I said, "filed this morning." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stared down at the papers, then up at me. For the first time since I'd known her, there was no control, no icy superiority, only naked, uncomprehending disbelief. I leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with her. "You were right, Margaret," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness. "I never belonged here." A pause, a breath. "But you never considered," I finished, letting the words sink in like a blade, "that one day you'd belong to me." Gasps filled the room, sharp and collective. Even the staff froze, wide-eyed. And in that perfect, suspended moment, the Queen realized her crown was gone, and I was the one wearing it. The grand Whitman dining room was silent. The same crystal chandeliers that had once seemed so cold and unreachable now cast their light across my table. The portraits of Whitman patriarchs stared down from the walls, but tonight their gazes didn't intimidate me. They bore silent witness to a legacy rewritten. Margaret sat directly across from me, her posture rigid, her face pale and drawn. The matriarch who once controlled this house, this family, this company, now looked like a ghost. Her fingers twisted the stem of her empty wineglass, the only sign of the storm she was holding inside. I placed the final set of documents in front of me and signed my name with deliberate care. The soft scratch of the pen seemed deafening in the cavernous room. Each signature was another brick removed from Margaret's crumbling empire, another piece of power reclaimed. As I finished, I looked up at her and spoke, my voice calm and clear. "The night you cast me out, Margaret, you told me I didn't belong here." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. "You thought you ended me," I continued, "but endings—" I allowed a small, wry smile to curve my mouth. "Endings are illusions. You never saw the beginning I was already building." The truth of it seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. For years, she'd been playing checkers while I'd been playing chess. I stood, gathering the documents, while Margaret rose slowly, her movements stiff, every ounce of dignity stretched to its breaking point. As she passed me on her way to the door, she paused for just a heartbeat. Without meeting my eyes, she whispered, so low only I could hear, "You destroyed us." I turned my head slightly, my reply smooth and cutting in its simplicity. No, Margaret, you destroyed yourself. I just refused to disappear. She left without another word, the soft echo of her heels fading down the hall until there was nothing left but silence. I returned to my seat at the head of the table, the same spot where Margaret had once reigned, and where, years ago, she'd watched me be cast out. I rested my hands on the polished wood and looked around at what was now mine: company, estate, legacy. Taking a deep breath, I let the final words settle in my mind, a full circle echo of my journey. I don't belong here, I whispered to the empty room. I own it.